What we're going to do is just look at a few different passages running through the text. We're not going to read it all. But as we do that, I want you to think about some of the lessons we could learn from this, and let's just talk about them as we go through. Now, right off the bat, we're introduced to Belshazzar. Who did we stop with in chapter 4? What king were we dealing with in chapter 4? Nebuchadnezzar, yeah. And so we have Belshazzar as the king in chapter 5, and there's not a whole lot of information about how all that transpired. There is some supposition about who he is. In the text, he's referred to either as the son of Nebuchadnezzar or the descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, depending on which version you have and how it might render it. The one I'm going to use on the screen tonight calls him a successor of Nebuchadnezzar. Folks are arguing about exactly who he is and how all of that works. Honestly, it doesn't make me a whole lot of difference if he's a grandson or if he's a nephew or if he's not related at all. That's really not the point of what we're discussing here. But the fact that he is his successor does matter, and that in fact is mentioned by Daniel, at least alluded to by Daniel, and of course the queen also. So Belshazzar is now the king in chapter 5. We'll go back and forth with him a little bit, but he is the king in chapter 5. And so it begins with Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. He had a really big party. Verse 2, you'll see on the screen there if you'd like to look at it. Verse 2 says, he was under the influence of wine, and he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king and his nobles and wives and concubines could drink from them. So the CSB says he was under the influence of. Anybody have a different rendering there? Tasted. All right. Anybody have anything else? Most of them say something like tasted. The way it reads is he had been drinking it and was celebrating. To the extent he was under the influence, I don't know. Just have no idea. Do you know? Does anybody in here know? I don't know. Doesn't matter to me. So that's where he is, and that gives us an opportunity to say, okay, if he was under the influence, literally, then it probably affected his judgment. The end result is that's not the thing that matters. His disposition and attitude overall is the thing that matters. Now, we can have a discussion about should we get drunk or not. How does that go? How does that discussion go? The question is, should we get drunk or not? What's the answer? No. There's all kinds of New Testament references. You have Galatians chapter 5, Ephesians chapter 5. There's several references in the New Testament that forbid it. Then there's principles that you see in the Old Testament like Proverbs 23 that says don't do what? Don't even look at it. Why wouldn't we look at it? It's tempting, and it does what in the context? It's very tempting, and it does what? In the context of Proverbs 23, it causes problems, right? That's just what it does. And so reasonably looking at all of that, you would say, okay, I need to avoid that. If it is very tempting and addictive, and we're aware of that, and if it causes problems, and sometimes problems that it's hard to recover from in the Proverbs 23 reference, and if drunkenness is condemned in the New Testament, how should we deal with it? We just stay away from it completely. Wholly stay away from it. Then you can stack on top of that the matter of influence. And so when you do that, you say, okay, who am I influencing if I don't stay away from it? And how am I either helping or hurting someone else if I don't stay away from it? What is my influence with it? And when you put all that together, the reasonable person says, from a New Testament standpoint and an Old Testament standpoint, you need to stay away from that because that causes problems. Here, Belshazzar is tasting it and maybe under the influence of it. And so he begins to have this celebration. And what is the problem with him drinking out of those vessels? The next verse, verse 4, says they drank wine and praised their gods made of gold and silver and iron and wood and stone. What is the problem here? Items taken from the temple, okay. Okay. And they were praising their gods who, as it records for us, are made of gold and silver and bronze and so on. You have one of those instances where several things collide, right? First of all, you're having a big party and you've got the wine out, and to some degree probably under the influence of it. Secondly, you're using things that don't belong to you in your great big party, They belong to who? Yeah, to God. They really don't belong to the Hebrews, the Jews, as much as they belong to God, right? Because they were His in the temple, in His service. They belong to God. And then while you're doing those two things, you put on top of that, you're praising your gods. Do you think there might have been a little bit of, attitude toward the captives and the fact that we're drinking out of their vessels? Maybe, probably, good chance. So all of that kind of combines to say this is not going to be a winning combination here. It's going to be a problem. And so then immediately, the fingers of a human hand appear and start writing on the wall. That kind of reminds me of something that happened in chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar. What might that be? You want to read my mind on it? While the word was still in his mouth as he walked around on his rooftop surveying all the grand things that he had done, while the word was still on his mouth, immediately God intervened. That's what God's doing here. He's dealing with these leaders of nations, and it's being recorded for us so we can see how He, and I'll use the word feels, reacts to our behavior and attitude toward Him. Can God be angry? Yeah. No question about that. It is a terrifying thing, the Hebrew writer said, to fall into the hands of the living God. It's terrifying. He can be angry. What do you see with Nebuchadnezzar and with Belshazzar, just on the surface, immediately in context, that angers God? Pride, yeah. Ridiculing Him and His things and His people, His systems, what He's put in place, yeah, all of that. So when you think about it like that, you know something's about to happen. And so this hand starts writing on the wall. And notice the end of the verse on the screen there, into verse 6. It says, the king's color changed, his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Was there an immediate impact on him? It got to him. Yeah, he realized whether he was drunk or not, whether he was under the influence a little or a lot, he realized something's going on, and he was afraid. Might we have been afraid also? Why, sure. So what did he do when he was afraid? What did he do? Verse 7, what did he do? Yeah, called for his wise men, tell him what's going on. That's what they did. And I suppose if your faith, if your trust, if your confidence is in gods made of gold and silver and stone and wood, who are you going to rely on? Are you going to rely on a piece of wood? I mean, when the handwriting starts writing on the wall, are you going to go to a piece of wood and say, okay, help me, I don't know what to do? Is that what you're going to do? You're going to go to people. That's all you got. That's all there is. You're going to go to somebody else. That's all that's left. By the way, that's what idolatry ultimately does. It makes people the center of it all, because down deep, we're smart enough to know, down deep, that the thing we or somebody else carved has no power. We know that. Whether we admit it's a whole other thing, but we know that. And so Nebuchadnezzar, when he has a problem, he doesn't turn to those idols, because he knows those, I know the guy down the street that carved that. What's that going to do for me? So he turns to his wise men and his magicians and all those folks that have the ability to do something and have told him some things over a period of time. Nebuchadnezzar did it. Belshazzar does it. That's who he goes to. What's their response? Verse 8. We can't read that. We don't know what that means. I wonder if over a period of time, Daniel's influence caused the wise men to start telling the truth. You ever thought about that? I know you have. We talked about that a little bit. Daniel's presence probably caused those wise men over a period of time to stop making things up, to stop lying. When the king says, come in and tell me what this means, had Daniel not ever been there, they might have said, well, let me tell you what that means, and just talked, because that's what the king wants. The king's going to get what the king wants. With Daniel on the scene, probably that changed their whole attitude, and now they can't just do that. Now they have to say, well, wait a minute. If we start making things up and he brings Daniel in and Daniel tells him the truth, then we have a real problem and he'll kill us. So they just told him the truth. We don't know. We can't do it. And when they said that, verse 9, he became even more alarmed. His face grew paler, and his nobles were perplexed. Everybody now in Daniel chapter 5 is worked up. Everybody's worked up. Belshazzar doesn't know what to do because the handwriting on the wall was real. It was literal. And he doesn't know how to handle it. And he has turned to the only source that he is really familiar with, some other person who also doesn't know how to handle it. Really good. I won't belabor the point. We've made it already, but it's a really, really good lesson for us that there are times when we need to turn to God and not people. That's just the way that is. If we want to know the real truth about something, if we want to know what God wants about something, what God intends, what God says, we need to go to His Word, not people. We need to learn to do that. Do we take advice along the way? Why, sure. Do we filter that advice through the Word? Absolutely we do. If I start telling you things that aren't in the text, you need to make me stop. That's how that works. And we have to rely on one another in that way. Belshazzar does all he knows to do, and what he knows to do will not answer the question. So the queen, maybe the queen mother, it might be his grandmother, it might be his aunt, it might not even be someone related to him, and she's probably not the queen in that she is what? Would have been what, if she's the queen literally? His wife. Probably not that. And why would we say that just on its face? Take history and the other things we can read and study out of it. Why would we say that? Because she has a very, very good familiarity with history, right? And what has happened with his predecessor that he apparently is not fully aware of. He's aware of some of it. We find that out because Daniel's going to tell him that, but probably not to the greater extent that she is. And so more than likely she's someone who's been around a little bit and remembers what happened earlier with Nebuchadnezzar. She comes in and she says, there's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods. Versions read differently about that. Spirit of the holy gods, you may have a footnote on that might be helpful to you. It might not be all that helpful to you, but some of them just say possibly the spirit of the holy God, but they're idolaters still. And so that's the view through which they see everything. And so she says, your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him as chief over all the magicians and mediums and Chaldeans and diviners and all of that. He saw something in this person, and he gave him a special position. And that's because Daniel had done some amazing things. And so she says about him, if you call Daniel, he will give you the interpretation. That's what she says about him. It says in the New American Standard in verse 12, let now Daniel be summoned and he will declare the interpretation. Does she have confidence in him? Seems like it. And that's a thing, to tell the king, even if you are the queen mother, whatever, to tell the king, this will be what you need. This is the answer. The magicians and diviners that he called in wouldn't do that. I find it interesting they didn't reference Daniel. It's probably, and I'm guessing here, so take it that way, it's probably another generation of folks. It's probably a whole new set of people, but I don't know. It may just be that they don't want him to come in again and do it again, you know. It may be they were so scared themselves they didn't think about it. But she has the wisdom about her, at least, to say you need to call Daniel. And so that's what happens. And the king says to Daniel, I can't get an answer. I can't figure this out. Verse 16, but I personally have heard about you, that you're able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. Has Daniel heard something similar to that before? He has, yes. Nebuchadnezzar promised him a whole lot and delivered. That's the one thing about these Chaldeans, these Babylonians. What they promised, they seemed to deliver. Now that goes both ways. When they promised to tear somebody's arms off, they would do that too. But when they made a promise to Daniel, when they said something to him, they seemed to deliver on it. And Belshazzar here is saying this and will deliver on this. But Daniel's response, I love it. He says, you can keep the gifts and you can reward somebody else. In other words, I'm not here for that. It goes back to some of the very first discussions we had in Daniel about the fact that he is there to serve Nebuchadnezzar, a man, listen to me, that we would not want to serve. We would have severe issues serving Nebuchadnezzar. I would be able to appeal to my conscience and my attitude and my disposition to try to do what's right and say, I can't serve that guy. Remember we talked about that. I want out because I'm not going to serve a guy like him. He's ungodly. Why would I serve him? And what's the answer to that? Because God put you here and told you to serve him. You're here. You do what you are supposed to do. And that's just such a good lesson for us, because sometimes we find ourselves in rough spots where we are confronted with that sort of thing. And so the question becomes, can I help this situation or not? Am I going to be somebody who improves it, or am I going to be somebody who's just causing a problem with it? Yes, sir. Yeah, very well could be. At the very least, he seems to not know much about the God that in chapter 4 Nebuchadnezzar said everybody's going to acknowledge. So whether they acknowledged him only or not is a point everybody can debate. But the fact is, Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 acknowledged who God was and what he could do, and that no one else could do what he could do. And Belshazzar doesn't seem to follow that same line of thinking. And I'm sure that's a part of the problem or the issue God has with him here. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering, in light of the circumstances, if there's a little bit of that Acts 8:20 business, your money perish with you, when he says, I don't want your money, considering now we've made a mockery of God by using his things. And is there a little bit of that perhaps with Daniel here, that I'll have no part or lot in this business, but I will tell you what the judgment on the wall
Yeah.
is?
It very well could be. The tricky part of it is when we get to the end of the story, Daniel actually does what? He lets them put the gold chain on him, and he lets them give him the position. And so I tend toward his initial reaction here when confronted with, we have a problem, we need you to help, is I'm not here to help for money. I'm not here to help for position. That's not what I'm here to do. And Daniel seemed to be one of those unique individuals that could separate himself personally and separate himself from how it affected him personally and just deal with the situation from heaven's point of view. That's what he does with Nebuchadnezzar, and that's what he's about to do with Belshazzar. And we talked about the fact that he probably doesn't like either one of them personally, although he did develop an affinity for Nebuchadnezzar because, well, he served him and wanted what was best for him. So he is confronted with, okay, if you answer the question, I'll do this for you. And his initial immediate response is, I don't need you to do anything for me. That's not why I'm here. So let's get on with the business. And so he discusses or explains what it's going to be. And what he says in all of this is, the majesty that you enjoy, the goodness that you enjoy, the position that you enjoy, God gave to you, right? Some versions will use a different word there instead of gave. Some will say God granted it to you in verse 18. God granted this. When God gives or grants, what did the receiver have to do with it? He didn't have anything to do with this. God did not grant unto Nebuchadnezzar or Belshazzar what they had because they were so good, did he? Why did he do it? It served his purpose, yeah. Because he was going to make good out of them. That's what he was doing. If that doesn't give you and me hope, I don't know what does. There are days when I'm not good. But God can make good out of that. And we need to be thankful for that. Can God make good out of people today who are like Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah. Say that with me. Yeah. Yeah. Do we sometimes have a real big attitude toward people who are similar to Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and want to have nothing at all to do with them and even want to talk about them a little bit, maybe gossip some? Yeah. We need to learn the lesson here, and we've emphasized it over and over again because it's a really good lesson for every one of us. That God can make good out of everybody and anybody, and he is doing that to the extent we will be a Daniel and go along and help and participate. So Daniel reemphasizes to him the same thing he told Nebuchadnezzar years earlier. Same thing. God has granted this to you. God has put you in this position. God has set you up and given you all of this. But Nebuchadnezzar's problem was, verse 20, his heart was exalted and his spirit became arrogant. Now, we remember that. We just talked about it the last 2 or 3 weeks. Nebuchadnezzar got arrogant. And so he was deposed from his throne, and his glory was taken away from him. That's what God did to Nebuchadnezzar. And then there is that sentiment in verse 22. But you, his successor, some versions say son, some versions say grandson. You, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. A lot of sermons have been preached on that last phrase, even though you knew all of this, right? Even though you knew this. Do you think that there will be some moments on the day of judgment that are similar to this? Does that make you a little nervous? Let me ask a different question. Does that scare you sometimes? Yeah. Even though we knew that going to a church building isn't the thing that saves us, although it is certainly a part of the process. Even though we knew that just sitting in a pew or a chair isn't the thing that saves us. Even though we knew we're supposed to be nice to people. Even though we knew we're supposed to spread the gospel. One of the things that most of us, many of us maybe, are really good at is coming up with reasons why we don't have to do the things we know. And for Daniel to walk in and say to Belshazzar, quick history lesson, just a quick one, and a reminder that you knew this and you have not responded. You knew what you should have done. You knew what the right play was, and you didn't do it. And man, that's serious. At the end of class last week, someone came up and made a really good point to me that I wish I had made during class because it was just fantastic. And it was about Nebuchadnezzar. And it was about how the moment Nebuchadnezzar turned his eyes back to the Lord, turned his focus back to the Lord, turned his heart back to the Lord, and was willing to acknowledge who God was and play by God's rules, the moment he was willing to do that, he was restored. His kingdom was restored. His glory was restored. All the blessings were restored. That moment. Do you think the same would have held true for Belshazzar? You're going to have to answer probably so. Because the same holds true for you and me. It's absolutely true that God's trying to save you. And He's trying to save all of us, sometimes while we're not acting like we want to be saved. Maybe we're acting like it, but down deep in our heart, we're not committed to it. But the moment we have the courage to turn our eyes and hearts back toward Him, He's there. People talk sometimes about, I'm too far gone. There's a lot of problems with that. One of them is Nebuchadnezzar's in the Bible, and God was willing to forgive him. We always cite people like the Apostle Paul. Is he too far gone? Peter, is he too far gone? We talk about that. Or in Acts chapter 8, Simon the sorcerer, was he too far gone? Not even close. That discussion, you'll notice, never comes up in Scripture. But when you go back and look at Nebuchadnezzar, he was gone pretty far. Not too far. You're never too far from God if you're willing to go back to Him. And so we think about that when we think about Belshazzar because we see Daniel saying, you knew all about this. You were familiar. How familiar was he with all the things Daniel had done and all the things Nebuchadnezzar had said and all that? I don't know, but he was familiar enough for Daniel to say, you knew it. You knew about this. Any comment about that before we move on? That again, a lot of sermons come out of, you knew this, and that's good. Anything else? Okay, verse 23, instead of responding to what you knew, and don't think that if you're sitting there and you're still stuck on you knew all about this and you haven't gotten past the fact that you know some things that you're not responding to and you haven't fixed yet and you need to make some adjustments and all that, if you're stuck on that, understand that you're not alone. You're never alone there. We're all in this process of admitting what needs to happen now. Now. What do I need to change now? I've made these changes. Maybe my whole life is full of changes. Maybe here lately I've made incredible changes. Maybe I've reorganized and revamped my whole life up to this point, but I'm still not where I need to be. What happens now? We're all there. So don't get down about that. Be determined that we're going to move on from that. Because what happens is, Daniel says, you knew about this and you didn't fix it. Instead, he says, in verse 23, you've exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. Now, the reason I think it's important to have a connection between those two things, between don't give up, don't stop, even if you know more changes need to be made, don't get down about that, is because what we tend to do sometimes, often, I think, is if we decide a problem is not solvable, then we don't look for a solution. If we decide we can't really get where we need to go, or getting there is going to cause so much upheaval in my life, or getting there is going to offend somebody in my family, or it's going to change a relationship here or there, it's going to make things harder for me some other way. If we decide that, then we ultimately say, well, then I can't or I'm not going to change. Listen, there are people every time we offer the invitation. You with me? Every time we offer the invitation, there are people sitting in the audience thinking, I know I need to do that. I know I need to do that. Whether it's obey the gospel for the first time or whether it's get right with the Lord, recommit to His cause, whether it requires a public confession of that or whether it just requires an attitude of determination in the heart and repentance in the heart. There are people every time who say, I need to do better. I need to make changes. I need to do that. I want you to understand that you can. We talked about that with Nebuchadnezzar. But what I also want you to see is the other side of that. If you don't, the response from heaven is this that you see on the screen. This is the response from heaven. We exalt ourselves against the Lord. We exalt ourselves against what He has said do, what He has told us we ought to do. And when we do that, we're going to lose. How had Belshazzar exalted himself against the Lord? How had he done that? Every version I saw said against, I think. Bringing the vessels in, yeah, doing that. Yeah, did he fear God? There is no indication that he had any fear of God. Was he respectful of God? There's no indication he had any respect for God. There's a tricky principle here that we don't preach often, we don't talk about a whole lot, because it has within it some undefinables. And so I want to be careful. I want you to understand what I'm saying. God is a responding God. He responds to the penitent heart. Sometimes we think everything has to be neatly lined up in order and my life has to be perfect, and once I get everything just the way it's supposed to be, then I'll obey the gospel. Then I'll come back to the Lord because I've got it all arranged and now He'll accept me. Is that the right way to look at it? What does He want from us? What does God ultimately want from you? Don't say obedience. What does He ultimately want from you? Yeah, He wants you to love Him and go to Him. That's what He wants. Do you think we're all going to Him in the same way, on the same path, at the same time, accomplishing the same thing for His cause? Do you think we're all there? We're all over the place. Some of us are barely staying on the road sometimes. What God is after is us wanting to be with Him, to seek after Him. Paul got to that in Acts 17. Remember that? That we would what? Seek and grope. What does that mean? What's grope mean? Give me another word. Reach out for Him. Yeah, that's what He wants from us. I am not saying that because of that you can compromise on other things the Scripture tells us to do or not do. I'm not saying that. I'm saying at our core, what our God wants is us to want to be with Him, to reach out toward Him, to recognize and acknowledge who He is. Then we can start making some changes that we need to make. Then we can clean up how we talk when we're at work. Then we can clean up the words we speak. We can do all of that. I'm not saying that stuff isn't important. What I'm saying is God's willing to forgive Nebuchadnezzar on the basis of Nebuchadnezzar saying, I now acknowledge that you are God and I am not. That's powerful. That's the kind of God we want, because that's not the kind of God you and I would be toward each other. And so when you see that kind of mercy, that kind of grace, even in the Old Testament, you've got to be impressed by that, and you have to see it here in what Daniel says. Daniel says, you knew all about this, but you didn't respond to it. Instead, what you did is you elevated yourself. Anytime we choose to do what we want instead of what He wants us to do, we have elevated self. And His view of it is not good, and He does not appreciate it. Is it so, you think, in our society that sometimes we're just a little bit too prideful to grovel to God and say, I need you, I need your help, I need your forgiveness? I tell you what worries me a lot is in our assemblies sometimes. We're just so concerned about being formal and doing everything decently and in order that we don't get to what's really the problem. The problem is my attitude toward my Creator. I need Him. I have no solution beyond Him. And we can say all day long, well, we had a very decent and ordered service, didn't we? But did we really go to God? Did we really say to Him, individually and collectively, you're all we have, and we need you? Maybe there's some work to do there. Because what we see in these two chapters, 4 and 5, is one who does that. And he's not a great guy, but he does that. And another one who is no different, except he doesn't do that. He says at the end of that verse 23, you have not glorified the God who holds your life breath in his hand and who controls the whole course of your life. You've worshiped idols made out of created things instead of worshiping the God of heaven. Does that remind you of any chapter beginning a book or letter in the New Testament? Maybe after Acts, right before 1 Corinthians, maybe, I don't know. Romans, yeah, there you go. Romans chapter 1, remember that? You're worshiping the creature instead of the creator. It's illogical. It makes no sense. Why would we do that? That's what Daniel's saying. You had an opportunity here to turn your eyes toward God and worship him, the one who made all this other stuff, and you just wouldn't do it. You know, part of the challenge with doing it means something's going to have to change, and it's not going to be God. You know that, right? That's how that is.
What you said earlier about wherever maybe think Philippians 2, where you work out your own salvation.
Yeah, that's a good reference. Sometimes when people say work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, they say make it up yourself. That's not at all what he's after. He's after you've got to do things that somebody else doesn't have to do. Some of us are going to have to work harder and do more to get to heaven than others. That's the way it is. Personality plays into it. Where we came from plays into it. Our tendencies and the challenges that are in our lives play into it. Who we spend time with plays into it. There's a myriad of things that would cause us to have different paths. But we all have to do the same thing. We all have to turn to him and work that out. That's a really good reference for us. I want you to think about, we're about out of time, so I want you to think about how what Daniel is saying is you just didn't honor God as God. That's, in essence, that is the problem. And because you did not do that, here's the interpretation of the message. The interpretation is God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Okay? Next on the list is you've been weighed in the balance and found deficient. By the way, if this reminds you of Matthew 25 and the judgment scene, let that be. That's okay. That's just fine. And then your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel started with all this glory and majesty that you have was given to you by God. And he ends with what? And God's going to take that away. Now, we're out of time, so let's stop here. We'll pick up with this, Lord willing, next Wednesday night. But what I want you to do is think about this for the rest of the week into next Wednesday night. God has blessed you and me somehow, some way with something, some things, some circumstances, just like he did with Belshazzar. And he wants us to recognize those blessings and that he is the giver of the good and respond to it. That's what he wants. And you tell me in the last 30 seconds, what will he do ultimately if we don't respond appropriately to what he has given us? He will, according to the text, he will take it away, right? Ultimately. Reminds me of what's written in the very end of the Revelation. God will take away his part from the tree of life, right? So let's think about that, and let's determine that we're going to do better turning toward him. Is that principle all over the text? It absolutely is. By the way, it's in Hebrews chapter 11 as well. We plan to be there Sunday morning, Hebrews 11, Sunday morning at 10:45 if you're going to be able to be with us. Maybe we'll touch on that then. Thank you so much for helping and participating.